She's made the case for the academic and cultural boycott that needs to be adhered to by all institutions, particularly those that are the direct result of such boycott. Again, my name is Sami Al-Aryan. I'm the director of the Center for Islamic Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. This is panel 4, titled Civilization and Weaponizing the Holocaust and Anti-Semitism. Our second panelist is Dr. Jamil Aydin. Dr. Aydin is professor of international and global history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's been teaching and writing about the 19th and 20th century political history of the world. His title is Ethnic Cleansing Through Civilizational Narratives. Dr. Aydin.
Thank you, Dr. Aryan. What I thought is that today I will share part of my research to explain why current narratives of clash of civilization replace the former colonial language of racial difference and inferiority. So I'm trying to explain one puzzle is that, as Ilham Pape said, that we have to pay attention to Europe's support for Israel. And in Europe, wherever you go, especially in Germany, everybody is anti-racist, but everybody is racist towards Palestinians and support Israel. Not everybody, I mean the official leaders. And European right, as well as American right-wing ideologies, they claim that they are not racist. Instead, they use the civilization word. And I want to share with you why we think as historians, intellectual historians, the language of civilization has to be paid attention as a new form of racializing Palestinians and justifying Israel. And I want to show the anti-Palestinian origins of the clash of civilization thesis of Samuel Huntington. In many ways, when I was visiting our encampment at the university campus at University of North Carolina, just before it was brutally suppressed by the by our administrations, by the military police brought from all over North Carolina. I couldn't help but to notice that this was the revenge of the children of Bernard Lewis against the children of Edward Said, the Zionism versus Palestinianism. The students at the encampment were very comfortable with different religious traditions. There were Jews, Christians, Muslims, and I think one student told me that as a Christian, he joined the Friday prayer on Friday day and then joined the Shabbat. They were very multi-religious, multi-ethnic, but they believed in humanity. They believed in universal rights. They did not believe in clash of civilization. And I want to tell why we get to the story of clash of civilization. I also want to note that we are in Sarajevo, and genocide of the Bosnian Muslims was also done in the name of clash of civilization. I read all the text of the not only Serbian fascists but the European right-wing ideologues, and they will quote, especially the people like Anders Breivik, they will quote from the anti-Bosnian Serbian fascists, who then quote Bernard Lewis and clash of Samuel Huntington in their writing. And then they will quote the Zionists and then create this narrative that if you're a Muslim, you do not belong to Europe, then you have to be expelled. The reason why I'm saying this is that we quoted many times how Israel is using this older colonial language of civilization versus barbarism from day one. So that this is a battle of European superior civilization against barbaric people. Together with that, and that actually I will tell why this discourse is so dangerous and why this came back, but together with that, actually there is another language that Israeli officials use, and that's the language of eternal clash between Islamic world and the Christian West. And we saw a best example of that language when Israeli foreign minister criticized and condemned the Spanish decision to recognize the state of Palestine. After that condemnation, he told the Spanish counterpart, he says, remember that your country was also occupied by radical Islamist like Hamas. And we wonder what that radical Islamist was. It was the state of, empire of Andalusia. It says Spain was also invaded by Islamic civilization in Andalusia, and Reconquista liberated Spain from this Islamic threat. Obviously, this is a outrageously shocking statement, especially for a Jewish person, because Andalusia was protecting rights of the Jewish subjects of the empire from the Christian oppression. And what happened in Spain after Reconquista is very shocking in terms of the rights of the Jews. But it also shows how the clash of civilization is now an ideology of racializing Palestinians and justifying genocide. The first, I'm going to start with the language of civilization as being always the method of colonialism and racism. I think we, especially for students in America, racism is something about the skin color. Skin color racism was there, but this is the less emphasized one. The real colonial language of genocide was through the language of civilization in international law and in international affairs. This has been highly documented, how Europe developed this gaslighting project of presenting itself as a civilized people and destroying Africans and Asians who are more civilized than them in the name of civilization. And that's the language of German genocide in Namibia, but British and French colonial genocides. This language is best analyzed and deconstructed and destroyed by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a leading Pan-African and African-American intellectual, and he said, I'm quoting, "Consciously and unconsciously, there is in the world today a widespread and growing feeling that it's permissible to treat civilized men in Africa as uncivilized if they are colored, and more especially of African-American, African descent." So this language of civilization also joined by a Japanese intellectual who caught attention, said that we Japanese, when we were doing tea ceremony, then we were considered barbaric. The moment we learned the European colonialism and destroyed people in Manchuria, suddenly we are called civilized. I think this language has immediately been recognized by anti-colonial intellectuals, famously by Gandhi, who was asked, what do you think about Western civilization? And he sarcastically noted, civilizing the West, it will be a good idea. Finally, Aimé Césaire, who noted this after World War II and Holocaust, saying in his argument for boomerang effect, he said that what Nazi Germany did to Europeans, and both Jews and non-Jewish, was a continuation of what colonial empires have been doing in Asia and Africa. He says that your cruelty in the name of civilization boomerang back to Europe, and now you're complaining. And he was trying to create sympathy in the European public opinion for the victims of European colonial genocides, which was ongoing at that time, of course, with the French oppression of Algeria. Ironically, Germans took that argument that he was trying to compare Nazism, Hitlerism with colonial racism, but they took it to a direction of uniqueness of Holocaust compared to colonial genocide, something that my colleague Rastegal will soon tell you more about. Then how did we move from here, from this notion of civilizational hierarchies, which was actually shattered and destroyed by the time Frantz Fanon wrote his indictment of European civilization and Aimé Césaire. It's very actually suspicious that that language came back because Europe, as Aimé Césaire said, is indefensible. He said Europe is indefensible with all the crimes it committed in the name of civilization. Then how did Europe revive that language of, as former European chancellor said, Europe is a beautiful garden and the rest of the world is a jungle, is something to think about. But I want to move from here to the language of clash of civilization. Israeli Zionist colonization of Palestine actually started with this language of colonization, as many of our colleagues talked about how early Zionism proudly talked about colonizing an inferior society and being a representative of the Europe's colonization. Against this language, Palestinians or Palestinianism have always embraced universality of humanity, universal human rights. So there is the struggle between Zionism and Palestinianism starts early on. Palestine was the most cosmopolitan part of the Ottoman Empire. All the Palestinians were equal citizens of the Ottoman Empire, including Jewish Arabs, Christians. And for them, Zionism of the Balfour Declaration was a violation of that cosmopolitan vision of equal citizenship in a state, and they never objected Jewish membership of their state, but they just objected to the idea of displacing the native immigrants, displacing them. What was happening with Palestinian resistance and the international struggle of Palestinians is that they reached its peak in terms of mobilizing an internationalist, humanist, global public opinion for the liberation of Palestine by the mid-70s, despite their military defeat. So we know the 67 wars and the 73-74 wars, and which will lead to the Camp David Accord and its disasters. But behind that military alliance and struggle, which was backed by all Afro-Asian countries, Global South, as well as eventually socialist bloc, there is an idea that the Palestinian struggle is a struggle of emancipation and enlightenment, that we now need to realize that it's the Enlightenment was actually represented by the Global South. And in some ways, there is some sort of a fulfilling the Hegelian, what we call the Hegelian vision of the end of history leading to enlightenment by the third world countries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the decolonization. And the Palestinians thought that they will fulfill that history's direction to freedom, and the struggle with Zionism will be this dialectic that will lead that. The transition to clash of civilization theory came at the peak of a Palestinian, at least intellectual victory, symbolized by the 1975 UN vote against Zionism. That Zionism as racism vote was overwhelmingly passed. Looking back, this is a very wise legislation. It followed this kind of South African model because for the global South countries, Palestine and South Africa became the kind of last battlefields of the struggle for justice in the world and emancipation from colonialism to post-colonial free states. It's in that context, the clash of civilization theory was forwarded by one of the leading Orientalists and the Zionist advocates, Bernard Lewis, which was then picked by Samuel Huntington. Clash of civilization thesis basically turned Palestine's universalist justice claims into an eternal clash between East and the West, or Islam and the West. And this was well observed and noted by Edward Said, even back in 1970s. I think that's the reason I think he wrote the Orientalism book, to note this new discursive shift. Now, we can say that, well, didn't we have an idea of multiple civilizations in the world? Yes, that's true. So wouldn't that mean that these civilizations will be in clash? No. That is not true, and I can assure you, as someone who worked on Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism, and as well as the idea of a Muslim solidarity, no one thought that civilizations should clash, even if they thought that there could be some sort of authentic civilizational values of Hinduism, Buddhism, Asians, and Africans. These civilizational values is to confirm that those countries do not need Western civilizing mission. They have their own universal traditions, and they always blamed European colonialists as believing a clash of civilizations. Otherwise, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims were in alliance in that process. So why clash of civilization? What it did to the global reputation of Palestine struggle. Clash of civilization, which emerged in the 70s together with two other important developments. One of them is the America's attack on the United Nations, which started because of Palestine. We shouldn't forget that, especially in 1975 vote. So the current American right-wing obsession about United Nations being too pro-Palestinian starts back then. Until that moment, actually, United States is more positive to the United Nations, and the Soviet Union is actually more negative. But then the roles switch, and America began to use the veto power at the UN against the Palestinians. And the second one is the use, as Darrell Lee and Liza Hajar and many other colleagues showed, is the word terrorism, from insurgency to terrorism, to use this language to delegitimize Palestinian resistance. Clash of Civilization as a third pillar start to depict Palestine's globalist, universalist, justice-oriented emancipation project as a zero-sum game clash between Jews and Muslims. As Obama said, this is a millennial, 1,000-year conflict. Biden said the same thing, and you can see in so many places a reflection of this prejudice narrative of the Palestinians supposedly embodying a millennial prejudice towards Jews, which is farthest from the truth one could ever think about. And it is strategically very useful in the sense that it makes resistance and liberation struggle a conflict which is irrational, and it also relativizes it. So we should not forget that the Clash of Civilizations' number one purpose is to make a struggle where on the one side, when someone is advocating justice, equality, and freedom, on the other side is another person advocating colonization, brutality, and genocide. It makes it as if this is all of a relative question, that no one has a universal values. And we can see this shift in the kind of Zionist, a comfortable Zionist defense of Nakba as a good thing. As many of you know, that Israelis denied initially that they perpetuated Nakba, and they thought that the Palestinians were lying. Until, in the late 1990s, one Israeli historian, Benny Morris, said, yes, Palestinians were right, they weren't lying. Israel had a policy to expel the Palestinians. But by 1990s, Clash of Civilization theory was so well established, then he began to brag about this. He said, yes, we expelled them, but it was a good thing to do, because if we hadn't expelled them, they would have done the same thing to us, which is an absolute lie, according to all historians, that Palestinians did not have an intention to expel the Jewish population from this area. I know that I will be mindful of the time, but let me get to my concluding remarks. So the Clash of Civilization theory is something has to be watched very carefully by all the activists and intellectuals. It will sneak into every analysis. It will be very poisonous. There is some sort of a good intentioned idea of embracing your own authentic civilization to decolonize the world. But this has to be done with caution, without the decolonization narrative. A good example of this is in the literature on 1948 partition. As our distinguished colleague Abed was just here talking about the resistance, have noted that 1948 is technically not the partition like in India. Because in the cases of a partition like in India, there were native populations who were already there, and British colonialism created what we call the fitna, the sedition between them, and then argued that the only way to prevent chaos and problem is to sort them out, kind of a poisonous idea. In the case of Palestine, the partition is not between two groups of people who have been there many, many years. Yes, there were indigenous Jewish populations who were not European, who had less to do with Zionism, but eventually they have to adjust. But partition was between the settlers, who just came very recently. Some of them were only 3, 4, 5 years old, and then to justify kind of a settler colonial situation and to justify the expulsion of the natives from this land. So that's, I think, one area where we have to be very careful where we do not subscribe to the clash of civilization theory. Another one, of course, is about the historical narrative of presenting a relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Europe always being conflictual. We forget that the Ottomans were equally European, which also tells a lot about racialization of Bosnian Muslims. And there is some sort of commonality of the experiences of how Bosnian Muslims were described as people who do not belong. Now, I'm going to conclude with the topic I started with, Edward Said versus Bernard Lewis. They have a very famous debate at Mesa in Chicago in 1982. It's on YouTube. I highly encourage everybody to watch it. It's all about Palestine still. The debate is technically on Orientalism, but we do know that Bernard Lewis was very close to Israeli government, Israeli leaders, and as well as Bush and Dick Cheney. He's famously said that the Arabs don't understand democracy. You have to hit them with the big stick to justify invasion and destruction of Iraq. We also know that this debate is won by Edward Said. So Palestinianism won because they were right in terms of their universalism, humanism, and justice and enlightenment. Many of my colleagues in America, all the Middle Eastern studies scholars, thousands of them, are basically followers of Edward Said. We do not teach history from the perspective of clash of civilization to justify Zionism. So what does Zionists do? They abandoned academia because they lost. Bernard Lewis never went to any Mesa conference or any other conference. He established his own association composed of Zionists, but I think average age of the people there is 77 and nobody goes there. His own alternative organization. But then they won. So in some ways, they abandoned academia, they lost the intellectual debate, but they didn't care. Then they leveraged Israel's interest to think tanks and lobbies with American right-wing and European right-wing. And that's the reason why there's some close connection between fascist right-wing parties in Europe and America and Zionism. They also went to do an outreach to Hindu fundamentalists, and that's the kind of big crack that in the global south, that India now withdrew itself from being one of the biggest supporters of Palestinian cause to a neutral or a position that seems very close to Israeli genocide justification. Thus, it was heartbreaking for me to see that people who believe in clash of civilization, who lost the intellectual debate, had enough political power to beat my students, who were true followers of Edward Said, not Bernard Lewis. So hopefully, those people who have the guns and the weapons and the power and the money will be defeated with our moral arguments. And I would like to caution everyone to watch out the poisonous clash of civilization narrative, which was developed against Palestinian struggle and in their own claim making and arguments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aydin. Just want to note that I was in the States when I could see how the theory of the clash of civilization, which Netanyahu keeps using nowadays in every speech, how they developed, particularly during the first Intifada. They start, in the past was just about the past, but how they induced Islamophobia into the lexicon of the public, and how then it became a political weapon. The first institution that was established in Congress was by former Mossad agents, in which they established a committee that was linked to the Republicans. It's called the Republican Committee. It wasn't part of Congress, but they call it the Republican Committee against terrorism and unconventional warfare. And I was following them because the initial thesis came in 2 Hebrew books about the Intifada and how they started, linking Islam and terrorism and this whole thing. Before it was Palestinian nationalism. Now with the rise of the Islamic factions, it became Islamic terrorism, and then it took off from there. And of course, the rest of the story with Samuel Huntington and how it became not just a political weapon. Well, first it was a media, then it was a political, and then it became a legal weapon that was used against many people, including myself. So the third and final panelist in this panel is Professor Raz Sigal. Professor Sigal is Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University in New Jersey. His research focuses on the Holocaust, modern genocide, and state violence, particularly in Central and Southeast Europe and in Palestine/Israel. And his speech is on Holocaust exceptionalism and Israel's genocide. Dr. Sigal.
So on 13th of October, Israel ordered more than 1 million Palestinians to leave immediately the northern part of Gaza to the south. A journalist and translator in Gaza described what followed in a voice message to a friend 2 days later, and I quote from A here. "I am still in my home in Gaza City. Many people fled to the south, but many stayed here in the north after they saw the massacre of 70 people and more than 200 injured on the road south. And then, after that, there was so much bombing in the south, massacres. People left Gaza, went to the south, and sought shelter with people there. And then they all got shelled. You even have people who fled to the south and came back to Gaza." End of quote. This forced displacement occurred under the conditions of Israel's, quote, total siege policies. That is, with severe shortages of food and clean water, medical supplies, and fuel very much felt by Palestinians within days. In A's message on 15th of October, he reported that, quote, "There's no water at all. It's a huge problem. It's catastrophic." Indeed, Israel's, quote, evacuation order on 13th of October intended to create catastrophe, which is precisely what Israel has done in its attack on Gaza in the last 19 months. In the language of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, Israel's 13th of October evacuation order, quote, "deliberately created conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part." The University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, a global Holocaust Memory Institute, interpreted the situation on 13th of October very differently. Executive Director Joel Citron and Board Chair Dr. Robert J. Williams described Hamas in their message that day as an organization, quote, "with an ideology rooted in anti-Semitism." They promised that, and again I'm quoting from there, "our programming will expand so that it not only creates opportunities for people to learn about and remember the Shoah, but also other victims of the same irrational hatred that led to the Holocaust and that persists today." End of quote. The Shoah Foundation then presented the Hamas attack on Israel in the context of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, legitimizing what former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett infamously said in an interview just the previous day. We all remember that: "We're fighting Nazis." This weaponization of the Holocaust and the concept of anti-Semitism erases Israeli history and turns the world upside down. Powerless Palestinians, forcibly displaced and attacked for decades under Israeli settler colonialism, military occupation, and siege, become the worst perpetrators in modern imagination, Nazis. This image then casts the Israeli settler state, armed with nuclear weapons and backed by its Western allies, as the ultimate victim. The depiction of Palestinians as Nazis disrupts the axiom in Israeli politics and society that the Holocaust is incomparable and unique, though at the same time, it strengthens another dominant idea that stems from the view of the Holocaust as unique, that is, that Israel, where many Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, is a unique state. Now, the concept of genocide, I'd like to suggest, has functioned from its formulation in the UN Genocide Convention in relation to this double uniqueness. Nazism and what we now call the Holocaust, no one, of course, used the term at the time, were imagined on a hierarchy as more terrible than genocide, what's called, in my field today, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, right, this hierarchy. And this then placed Israel on another imagined hierarchy as more moral than any other state in the world. This gave rise to a common view in Israel and the West that the Israeli army is the most moral in the world, so that from Israel's establishment in 1948, it became unimaginable that it actually can perpetrate any crime under international law, let alone genocide. Maintaining this foundational image of Israel in the West required the denial of the 1948 Nakba and the ongoing Nakba, a denial that also stemmed from the broader impetus to deny the nature of the Israeli state as a settler colonial project. This impunity for Israel in the international legal system also functioned to carve an exceptional status for Israel in the field of Holocaust studies. Notwithstanding the mountain of evidence of decades of crude violations of international law by Israel, scholars, programs, centers, museums, and journals in Holocaust studies have minimized, marginalized, and disavowed Israeli state and settler violence, also after October 7th, 2023. On 17th of November 23, a group of over 150 Holocaust scholars, led by Jan Grabowski, a professor at the University of Ottawa, posted a statement online. Like the Shoah Foundation, these scholars separated the Hamas attack from the history of Israel and Palestine, placing it instead in the context of the Holocaust and claiming that the atrocities that day, and here I quote from their statement, unavoidably bring to mind the mindset and the methods of the perpetrators of the pogroms that paved the way to the final solution. The statement includes no mention of any form of Israeli state violence, nothing. This outright denial reflects the way in which these Holocaust scholars, more than 150, understand the legacy of the Holocaust as one that provides license to state violence rather than protection to groups facing it. Now, not all Holocaust scholars engaged in such justification of Israel's genocide in Gaza. A small but significant minority has confronted the reality of Israel's destructive assault on Gaza from the very beginning, even as it took time for most scholars in this group to acknowledge the genocidal character of the attack. Some of them, such as Omer Bartov, have shaped the study of the Holocaust in important ways. Many of them are Jews, including Israeli Jews, which makes it particularly urgent for those justifying Israel's genocide to delegitimize them. The mechanism for this delegitimization also emerged from the world of global Holocaust memory, primarily the infamous working definition of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, adopted in its meeting in Bucharest in 2016. IHRA is another global Holocaust memory organization consisting of delegations from its 35 member states, including the United States and Israel. The working definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, offers a very vague definition, but it also includes as an integral part of the document 11 examples, 7 of which focus not on Jews, but on criticism of Zionism and Israel as anti-Semitism. Now, this turns the historical struggle against anti-Semitism on its head. Rather than protecting a people, Jews, from discriminatory, exclusionary, and violent states, the IHRA definition protects a state, Israel, from criticism of its discrimination, exclusion, violence, and now genocide against the people, Palestinians. It was Yehuda Bauer, the well-known Israeli Holocaust scholar, who played a key role as honorary chairman of IHRA in the adoption of the IHRA definition in 2016. Bauer was probably also the first Holocaust scholar to justify Israel's attack on Gaza. In an article in early November, he presented, quote, Hamas barbarism as necessitating the protection of, and again I quote from Bauer here, a more or less civilized Israeli society. We just heard about the clash of civilization idea. Mirroring the dehumanizing rhetoric in Israeli politics and society, Bauer described, and again I'm quoting from him here, two worldviews that appeal to different types of the human universe. This required, he continued, quote, a relentless struggle. Bauer passed away the following year on 18th of October 2024 at the age of 98. An online event in his honor 2 months later was devoted fully to an attack against Holocaust scholars, mostly Jews, including myself, who have written and spoken out about Israel's genocide in Gaza. One of the speakers in the online event, German political scientist Lars Lenzmann, said, quote, that the genocide claim against Israel is part and parcel of the history of 20th and now 21st century anti-Semitism, end of quote. It was a very strange spectacle of a German professor who tagged Jewish Holocaust scholars as anti-Semites, including those who grew up in families with Holocaust survivors. Now, this demonstrates the length to which Zionists and their supporters will go to justify Israel's genocide in Gaza. But this absurdity has now extended well beyond arguments between scholars to become law. Here in the United States, Israel's key ally and arms supplier. The IRA definition is now the basis for legislative efforts. Indeed, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, based on the IRA definition, passed a vote with a large majority, 320 to 91, in the House last year during the Biden administration, and is currently in discussion in the Senate. The U.S. Department of Education, however, has already adopted, in effect, the IRA definition as part of the U.S. government's big lie about rampant anti-Semitism on college campuses. Big lie shared by the current Trump administration and the former Biden administration. This attack on the academic world is a core element of Project Esther, the plan to combat anti-Semitism that is part of Project 25 of the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, this organization of Christian nationalists, white supremacists, and very real anti-Semitism with various unofficial ties to the government, lays bare the absurdity of the politics of defining anti-Semitism. Project Esther discards the IRA definition's thin pretense to differentiate between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, and instead the document defines anti-Semitism as, quote, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American. Anti-Semitism is thus any and all criticism of a new Christian nationalist trinity, the United States, Israel, and Zionism. Now, this world turned upside down is the genocide-generating world of the settlers. In this case, the American settlers, who will do anything and everything to make sure that we do not speak the truth about the Israeli Jewish settlers. For the truth about the ongoing Nakba in Palestine is also the truth about the ongoing Nakba in Turtle Island. Maintaining this world of annihilation of Palestinians and other indigenous people also requires, in good Christian nationalist fashion, the redefinition of Jews, rendering anti-Semitism only about Israel and Zionism, and about the Christian empire. And thus, an empire again decides who are the, quote, true Jews, the good Zionists in this case, as opposed to the bad Jews, the anti-Zionist Jews. All of this with the full support of the empire's Holocaust institutions and their Holocaust lessons, which were always the empire's lessons. Thank you.
Answer it in a concise and precise way. If someone tells you that you are either a self-hating Jew or you're anti-Semitic because you criticize Israel, how would you respond to that? Which is contrary, obviously, to the IRA definition.
So, I mean, it's quite simple, I think. and straightforward. There's a very clear difference between a state and a people. And so Jews and Israel are, in a very simple way, not the same thing. Of course, it's an integral part of the Zionist project and the Israeli state project to conflate Jews and Israel, the self-proclaimed Jewish state. And of course, that's an integral part also of adopting the exclusionary and racist perspective of the state itself. I mean, obviously, today, 21% of the state citizens are not Jews. And according to the 2018 basic nation state law, the state treats them as, at best, second-class citizens. But again, to come back to the point, the state, Israel, and the people, Jews, are not the same thing. And therefore, I mean, and this is really, I think, the key point, right? There has to be a clear rejection, right, of the idea that criticism of Israel and criticism of a political ideology, Zionism, has anything to do with anti-Semitism. My position is that criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism has nothing at all to do with anti-Semitism, just as if I present criticism of the Russian state and its invasion of Ukraine, and even say that it includes genocidal elements, which I think it does, right, does not make me, someone who expressed racism against Russians at all. The same thing. Now, part of this is also rooted in the kind of, and this is my last point, part of this is rooted in the exceptionalization, as I said, of the Israeli state, right? Its presentation in the frame of thinking about the Holocaust as unique, thinking about Israel as unique, and of course, thinking about Jews as unique in the Judeo-Christian, quote unquote, civilization, right? So we can't actually, even in this framework, think comparatively in the way that I just suggested, right? Criticizing Russian state policies and violence is not racism against Russians, and therefore the same applies in the Israeli case, right? That is kind of almost unimaginable in the Israeli case, which has to be exceptional. Israel has to be a unique state. I think that it's very important to reject that, outright. That's my response, right? That no criticism really of Israel, no criticism of Zionism as a political project has really anything to do with anti-Semitism. And maybe, if I may, just one more minute about one more comment, if that's okay, about this, is that really, Israel, we have to understand that Israel was created at the intersection of the nation state project, self-proclaimed state of the Jewish people, so the exclusionary nation state project, and the settler colonial state, right? So it was actually, and if we think about the white supremacy that is at the heart of settler colonialism, and anti-Semitism is very central to white supremacism. And if we think about the nation state system as something that played a role in the persecution and destruction of Jews during World War II, if we think about Hungarian state violence, Romanian state violence, so on and so forth, then we understand the tragic reality where Israel was created as a response to the Holocaust, but at the intersection of the political structures and systems that had targeted Jews and ultimately targeted them for destruction during World War II. In that sense, we can say that Israel, as I have argued in a recent article, was actually from the beginning an anti-Semitic state. It reproduced anti-Semitism, right? And that's what I called in that recent article, settler anti-Semitism. So in that sense, it also adds to this idea that no, criticism of Israel is not at all anti-Semitism. In fact, it's part and parcel of the historical struggle against anti-Semitism. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to the Honorable Jury of Conscience and attendees of the Gaza Tribunal. My name is Maya Wind, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Riverside. It is an honor to join you today for this tribunal, an essential and urgent civil society effort to stop the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people. We know that this genocide did not begin 19 months ago. Genocide is structural to the Israeli settler state. All settler colonial states are founded with the imperative to eliminate and replace the indigenous peoples of the lands on which they were built. To maintain their settler state, settlers must continually reassert their exclusive claim to the land, a project that requires narrative and intellectual scaffolding. In the case of the Israeli settler state, universities have served as foundational institutions to legitimize its colonial eliminatory project and apartheid rule over the Palestinian people. Israeli universities produce expertise to internally sustain the Israeli settler state, as well as to sustain its international standing, undermining global efforts to hold it to account. This testimony will outline two mechanisms by which Israeli universities facilitate Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people. First, by documenting the Palestinian decolonial epistemologies they disallow, and second, by documenting the colonial knowledge Israeli universities themselves develop. In suppressing critical research, writing, and education about Israeli settler colonial and apartheid rule, and in offering expertise to legitimize this violence, Israeli universities sustain the genocide and ongoing Nakba. University administrations have long stifled critical Palestinian epistemology, research, and pedagogy, but they have escalated the suppression of Palestinian knowledge and student mobilization since October 2023. Israeli universities have consistently constrained the right of Palestinian faculty to investigate the subjects and events most central to the Palestinian experience. The founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and with it, the mass expulsion, dispossession, and fragmentation of the Palestinian people. The Nakba is what led to the very creation of Israeli citizenship for Palestinians. In repressing its study, the Israeli Academy is excluding the most foundational research questions from the Palestinian perspective, and in so doing, seeks to erase and deny their very identities as Palestinians. Beginning with research into the Nakba, Israeli universities have limited opportunities to critically explore Palestinian history, and with it, the Palestinian present. Over the past 2 decades, the Israeli Academy has overwhelmingly coalesced with the state to further constrain the right of Palestinian faculty and scholars whose critical research, writing, and teaching has been increasingly made untenable. Palestinian epistemology is routinely delegitimized as scholarship through mechanisms of policing that scholar of education Sarab Abu Rabi'a Quider calls unmarked forms of discipline and punishment. As universities produce scholarship advancing Palestinian dispossession, they continually deny their Palestinian students the right to resist it. These students, Palestinians whose Israeli citizenship was itself created as a result of the 1948 war, and many of whom have relatives displaced by it, have been restricted in educating their peers about the Nakba or mobilizing for Palestinian return. Palestinian student groups across campuses have faced permit denials, disciplinary hearings, and violent repression of events, vigils, and protests commemorating and educating students about the Nakba on Israeli campuses. Since October 2023, Israeli universities have escalated their campaign to suppress Palestinian students. For online posts, speech on campus, and political organizing, Palestinian students have faced suspensions, expulsions, orders to vacate campus dorms, disciplinary committees by university administrations, and interrogations and arrests by Israeli police and security forces. With no due process, and in a move that human rights organization Adalah has argued is a violation of foundational civil rights, university administrations have accused their students of, quote, support for terrorism, and referred student cases to the police for criminal investigation. After months of escalated political repression on campus, on Nakba Day in May 2024, Palestinian students at the University of Haifa nevertheless organized a rally against what they called the ongoing Nakba. They explained that the Gaza Strip was itself created as a refugee camp to which Palestinians from across historic Palestine were deported in 1948, and that Palestinians within Gaza were currently being further displaced. As they wrote, quote, "It is not possible to separate the Nakba from the war and vice versa." The university response was unequivocal. It refused to authorize the rally and assured the Israeli press that the protest would absolutely not take place on its campus. Palestinian student protests against what they articulate as the ongoing Nakba in May of 2025 also ended with the violent arrests by Israeli police forces. In offering their campuses as sites of knowledge production to design and legitimize Palestinian dispossession, but not for critical education about this project, Israeli universities actively sustain it. In so doing, they deny their Palestinian faculty and students not just academic freedom, but also the opportunity to study, understand, and most importantly, intervene in the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people. Israeli universities do not only actively repress educational activities that seek to disrupt Israel's violent machinery, but sustain this machinery itself. Through their structural ties and collaborations with the Israeli state, Israeli academic disciplines have themselves become integral sites of knowledge production that maintain Israel's system of apartheid and the project to eliminate the Palestinian people. While examples abound across the sciences, social sciences, and humanities, today I will detail how the field of legal studies creates a discursive, ethical, and legal infrastructure to shield Israel from accountability for its war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel is an innovator in interpreting international humanitarian law, with the occupied Palestinian territory as its laboratory. Illegally governing the Palestinian people through military occupation for decades, Israel has developed a corpus of laws and legal interpretations to sanction its regime. As legal scholar Noura Erekat shows, this development expanded with rising Palestinian resistance throughout the Second Intifada, which began in 2000. As it waged military campaigns to subdue Palestinian protesters and insurgents and came under international scrutiny, Israel began to advance arguments that its use of force against Palestinians constituted a new form of warfare, which could not be subject to regulation by existing bodies of law. Over the course of its interpretive innovation since, Israel has created the legal infrastructure to justify extrajudicial assassinations, torture, and deployment of what would otherwise be considered disproportionate use of force against civilian populations. Israeli universities have offered themselves as key sites for this military strategizing and legal innovation. At Tel Aviv University's Institute of the National Security Studies, INSS, scholars and senior security state personnel join forces to develop legal guidance for the Israeli government and military. During his tenure as INSS director, Israeli Major General Amos Yadlin collaborated with leading state ethicist Asa Kasher to publish such ethical and legal guidelines for over a decade. In INSS journals, Kasher and Yadlin argue that traditional conceptions about the nature of warfare and how to restrict it do not apply to what they define as Israel's, quote, war on terror, and therefore that international law is not the point of departure for Israel's, quote, counter-terror doctrine. In this context, they have ranked the value of human life to justify greater numbers of civilian deaths, and Kasher even proposed a new category to contravene the legal distinction between combatant and civilian, when he coined the term third population, persons who may potentially interfere with Israeli military operations, in reference to Palestinian civilians. Legal infrastructure developed by faculty and research fellows at Israeli universities consistently shapes Israeli military operations and legitimizes their tactics. This scholarship has worked to shield Israel from accountability, often in direct response to international condemnations or probes, and sometimes even anticipating them during Israeli operations in real time. In May of 2021, the INSS offered a defense of Israel's offensive on the Gaza Strip, even as it was still being carried out, claiming that it cleared the threshold of proportionality based on its reading of excessive damage in international humanitarian law. Simultaneously, the INSS works to undermine the legal expertise and legitimacy of international regulatory bodies. In 2022, it published legal arguments challenging both the ICC's jurisdiction and its definition of war crimes, and offered policy recommendations for the Israeli government to obstruct investigations into Israeli activity in the occupied Palestinian territory on this basis. In 2024, Israeli faculties of law and legal scholars have mobilized explicitly to delegitimize a South African petition charging Israel with committing genocide against the Palestinian people. A number of university officials condemned the petition and the hearings at the International Court of Justice. Just days after South Africa presented its petition, Tel Aviv University's INSS held an urgent discussion with program director and the former head of the Military Advocate General Corps Department of International Law, Pnina Shavit Baruch, as well as senior officials from the Israeli Ministries of Justice and Foreign Affairs. The explicit goal of the discussion was to strategize about how best to discredit the South African petition with legal scholarship as a crucial weapon. Shavit Baruch clarified that Israel understands the international arena as, quote, a battlefield, in which, quote, you have to know the enemy in order to know how to deal with the enemy. Shavit Baruch emphasized that what she called irresponsible statements made by the military and state leadership, alongside snuff videos released by soldiers on social media, were doing great damage and would, quote, be used against us. She was referring to the long and meticulously documented list presented by the South African legal team of dehumanizing statements about Palestinians made by Israeli officials and soldiers alike that could further substantiate the evidence of genocidal intent. Shavit Baruch emphasized that what Israelis say aloud is important and will influence not only international lawyers and public opinion, but also judges at the ICJ. She argued for constructing legal arguments that explain the destruction of Gaza based on claims of threat to Israel rather than, quote, revenge, which for judges and jurists is not a good enough argument, quote. From a legal perspective, Shavit Baruch explained, quote, you cannot now kill thousands of Palestinian children in Gaza because of revenge. This is why the argument that presents the continual threat is very important, end quote. For decades, Israeli universities have produced legal scholarship to sanction Israeli crimes against humanity, while they define critical research and discussion of historical and present Israeli state violence as illegitimate and even criminal. Israeli universities have built the scholarly infrastructure to repeatedly legitimate widely condemned Israeli war crimes. Israeli universities now facilitate Israeli impunity as it commits the crime of genocide. Thank you.